There was a time when the most powerful people in America leaned in to hear a young woman in a black turtleneck talk about a single drop of blood. Not only was she a 19-year-old Stanford dropout, on paper she became the youngest self-made female billionaire in the world, running a $9 billion company that promised to rewrite the rules of medicine. Her name was Elizabeth Holmes, and the empire she built was called Theranos. In conference rooms from Silicon Valley to Washington, she spoke in a low, deliberate voice about a future where a finger prick could replace vials drawn from veins, where hundreds of tests would run on a tiny cartridge, where disease would be caught early and cheaply. It sounded at times inspiring and at times chilling, because if it worked, it would change life for every family that ever sat in a waiting room dreading lab results. At the center of it all was a beige box with a grand name, the Edison. This machine, Theranos claimed, could run up to 200 blood tests from a single drop. Cholesterol, cancer markers, infections, even complex hormone panels, all from a device that looked like a printer. Investors poured in money. Walgreens built clinics. Safeway quietly spent hundreds of millions preparing for a rollout. On the surface, it was the perfect Silicon Valley story of wealth, power, and innovation converging. Behind the scenes, the Edison never truly worked as advertised. Most tests were secretly run on traditional machines from other companies, hacked together in backrooms. Results were unreliable, quality controls were ignored, and the miracle box that justified a $9 billion valuation was closer to a prop than a product. The entire company became a house of cards, held up by secrecy, intimidation, and a single world-shaking lie about what that little box could do. Yet look at who believed it. Former secretaries of state sitting on the board. Four-star generals lending their reputations. Fortune 500 CEOs and billionaire heirs wiring money into Theranos on the strength of Holmes's promise. They weren't just backing a startup, they were endorsing a new medical reality and putting real patients into the system. Finger prick tests were used in Arizona clinics, influencing diagnoses, prescriptions, even life and death decisions. So what is this story? Is it the story of a visionary who flew too close to the sun, trapped by her own impossible ambition, or of a calculated con artist who weaponized Silicon Valley hype against the most vulnerable people in the healthcare system? It's an example of what happens when faith in disruption outruns the hard limits of science, when charisma is treated as evidence and doubt is treated as disloyalty. To understand how that lie grew so large, let me take you back to a quiet childhood in Washington, D.C., to Stanford dorm rooms where the idea first took shape, then into secret labs, legal threats, whistleblowers, and finally a courtroom where the myth shattered in public. Because the patterns that built Theranos did not die with Theranos, and they may already be at work in the next miracle everyone is too afraid to question. There was a time when a routine blood test meant rolling up your sleeve, watching vials fill one after another, and then waiting days for answers that might change a life. Elizabeth Holmes walked into that world and promised to erase it with a single drop. One tiny finger prick, a few microliters of blood, and a machine on a countertop that could run hundreds of tests at once, instantly, cheaply, for everyone. Not only did that sound efficient, it sounded like power handed back to ordinary people. No more skipping tests because they were too expensive. No more avoiding hospitals because of a fear of needles that went back to childhood. In Holmes's story, early detection would no longer be a luxury of wealth or geography. A soldier in a remote base, a farmer miles from the nearest clinic, a single mother working 2 jobs in a city labored by medical debt. All of them could know what was happening inside their bodies in time to do something about it. Let me take you back to the way she told it. Holmes didn't just pitch a gadget. She framed Theranos as a moral mission, almost a crusade against preventable suffering. She spoke about cancer patients who only found out when it was too late, about families blindsided by heart attacks that a simple test might have flagged years earlier, about young soldiers bleeding in war zones where traditional labs could never reach. Questioning the dream began to feel like questioning whether those people deserved a chance to live. Because of that framing, skepticism carried a quiet social penalty. Investors who asked too many questions risked looking cold or short-sighted, the ones who cared more about quarterly returns than about saving lives. Journalists who pushed for data could be painted as negative, the enemies of innovation. It's an example of what happens when a story is at times inspiring and at times chilling, when it mixes genuine human pain with the promise of a technological miracle. The money followed the emotion. Billionaires, former cabinet secretaries, retired generals, media moguls, they lined up not just to invest, but to associate their names with the cause. Walgreens and Safeway poured hundreds of millions into partnerships, building in-store clinics around a device they had never truly verified. Magazine covers declared Holmes the youngest self-made female billionaire, Silicon Valley's new icon, the heir to a very familiar black turtleneck empire. Yet under all that praise, there was an odd silence. No published peer-reviewed data, no outside lab validation. Employees bound by extreme NDAs, cameras everywhere, teams split and forbidden to talk. Inside Theranos, a culture of fear replaced open inquiry. And that raises the question that should have stopped everything much earlier. If a miracle in a drop of blood really worked, why did it have to be protected like a state secret? The answer to that takes us from the glowing stage lights of TED Talks and magazine shoots into the locked doors and whispered threats of Theranos' labs, where the gap between promise and reality grew wider every day. Behind those locked doors, the story stops feeling like a glossy tech launch and starts looking like something else entirely. On one side, there is the headline, Fantasy. A 19-year-old woman breaking into a male-dominated world of money and power with a device that could change medicine forever. On the other, there is the quieter reality. Lab techs watching numbers jump around like a slot machine, while real patients wait for results that might decide chemo, surgery, or nothing at all. That tension is the moral line this story is about to cross, because this isn't just a tale of one bad founder who lied. It's an example of what happens when unchecked ambition, investor FOMO, and a culture obsessed with disruption all crash into a field that cannot afford to fail. In social media, a glitch is annoying. In ride-sharing, a bug means waiting a few extra minutes. In blood testing, a single wrong value can send a healthy person to the ER or send a sick person home with a false sense of safety. Silicon Valley loved the narrative. A young Stanford dropout channeling Steve Jobs, promising to compress a full lab into a sleek little box, raising hundreds of millions, and building a $9 billion empire out of thin air and perfect confidence. At times inspiring, and at times chilling, the arc looked like a dream. The first self-made female tech billionaire, disrupting an industry run by gray-haired men and slow machines. But medicine doesn't care about magazine covers. Molecules don't move faster because a founder speaks in a baritone and wears a black turtleneck. To understand how that dream twisted into fraud, let me take you back to before the turtleneck, before the deepened voice, before the board stacked with generals and former secretaries of state. There was a time when Elizabeth Holmes was a quiet, intense kid in Washington, D.C., the daughter of a government bureaucrat and a congressional committee staffer, soaking up stories about lost family wealth and grand legacies. In that home, Money and status weren't just nice to have. They were what had been taken and what might be reclaimed. From there, the path moves quickly. Precocious teenager, Mandarin classes, chemical engineering at Stanford, and then the moment she walks into a professor's office with an idea about painless blood tests and refuses to hear the word impossible. His story is one of relentless discipline. Hers is one of relentless belief. He built refineries. She wanted to build a black box that could read a life from a pinprick. We will follow that belief as it scales, from dorm room sketches to incorporation papers in 2003, from Stanford prodigy to startup darling raising money from billionaires, from secretive labs to Walgreens clinics, from embattled CEO to convicted felon. Along the way, the question will keep coming back. When does vision become deception, and when does deception become a crime? And at the center of that question sits a scene that would finally rip the illusion open. A young employee standing in a Theranos lab late at night, watching wildly inaccurate results pour out of a machine that was supposed to be the future. On the other side of those numbers are real names, real families, real bodies. In that moment, the employee realizes something that the investors, the board, and the public have not yet seen. And the decision made next will determine who gets ruined first: the patients, the whistleblowers, or Elizabeth Holmes herself. Before the machines, before the Walgreens deals and the $9 billion valuation, there was a little girl learning what power looked like from the back seat of a car. Let me take you back to Washington, D.C., in the late 1980s, where Elizabeth Holmes is growing up just a few miles from the Capitol, listening to adults talk about money, policy, and prestige as if they were elements on a periodic table. Her father, Christian Holmes, worked in government and then at companies brushing close to Enron's orbit, chasing big energy projects and the kind of corporate success that could restore a fading family name. Her mother, Noel, had been a Hill staffer, fluent in the language of senators, hearings, and hierarchy. There was a time when the Holmes family had been genuinely wealthy, with ancestors who helped build hospitals and held real social standing. By the time Elizabeth is born, that empire is mostly a memory. The money is thinner, the status more theoretical than real. Inside the home, that gap becomes a story. Relatives talk about the great Holmes line, about philanthropy, about what used to be. The subtext is simple: greatness was lost, and someone needs to win it back. For a child already wired for intensity, that narrative lands like an assignment. Her life cannot be ordinary. It has to be a comeback. When the family moves to Houston, the scenery changes, but the theme does not. Oil money, energy executives, and corporate towers form the background, while Elizabeth throws herself into school with a kind of ruthless focus that teachers remember years later. She studies Mandarin, pushes for advanced classes, and competes to be the best student in every room. Classmates recall how she speaks in grand, almost rehearsed lines about wanting to change the world, even when everyone else is just trying to pass chemistry. Technology and medicine become her chosen stage. She plays with engineering kits, sketches ideas for devices, and dives into science programs. At the same time, a reported fear of needles turns into a personal obsession. Why does something as simple as a blood test have to hurt? Later, that detail will be polished into a perfect origin story, repeated to investors and journalists as if the entire empire grew out of one terrified trip to the clinic. Early on, she discovers something crucial. Adults love certainty. When she speaks with absolute confidence, when she tells a big story about the future in that steady, controlled voice, doors open. Teachers nominate her for programs. family friends introduce her to powerful people, mentors lean in. Because of that response, the lesson is clear. If the story is big enough and told with enough conviction, people will suspend doubt. At times inspiring and at times chilling, her path from ambitious teenager to Stanford prodigy is an example of what happens when that lesson goes unchallenged. In the next phase of her life, that same talent for projection will collide with Silicon Valley's hunger for disruption, and the line between vision and lie will start to disappear. There was a time when the most powerful idea in Silicon Valley was not a product, but a story. Leave school, build a company, change the world, get very rich. Elizabeth Holmes walks into Stanford carrying that script like a blueprint. Chemical engineering major, presidential scholar, alone in a place that worships intelligence, money, and disruption with almost religious seriousness. Let me take you back to those first years on campus. She is surrounded by legends recited like scripture. Bill Gates leaving Harvard, Michael Dell leaving UT, Mark Zuckerberg leaving Harvard again, each dropout turning a dorm room project into an empire. Not only are these men treated as visionaries, they are framed as brave for walking away from tradition. The lesson is simple. If the idea is big enough, school starts to look like a delay, not a path. In the middle of this environment stands Channing Robertson, senior Stanford professor, founding chair of chemical engineering, a man whose name carries real power in academia and industry. He sees Holmes not as an awkward freshman, but as a generational talent. He lets her into advanced research, praises her questions, tells colleagues she might be the next great entrepreneur to come out of Stanford. When a figure like that validates someone, the effect is electric. It feels like destiny being confirmed. Her first real idea grows out of that lab and that praise. A small, wearable patch. On the surface, it is elegant. It would draw tiny amounts of blood, analyze it in real time, diagnose disease, then release the right drug through the skin. All in one closed loop. It sounds efficient, humane, futuristic. It is also, for the early 2000s, wildly beyond what the technology can actually do. From the beginning, her story is one of collapsing the distance between science fiction and present reality by speaking as if the gap does not exist. Around her, that attitude is not just accepted, it is glorified. This is the culture of fake it till you make it, of move fast and break things, of pitch decks that promise global domination before a single product ships. In software, a bug means a crash, an update, maybe an apology. In medicine, a bug can mean a misdiagnosis, a wrong dose, a death. Yet in the Valley's mythology, those differences blur. A health company can be pitched like a social app, just with a bigger market. Because of this mix of validation, ambition, and myth, the next step begins to feel inevitable. Classes become obstacles. Lab safety rules feel like chains. Homework looks trivial next to the chance to build a multi-billion-dollar empire that might, at least on paper, save millions of lives. At 19, she makes the decisive move. She walks into the Stanford administration, signs the papers, and walks out a dropout. Not a failure, but, in her mind, a founder. It is an example of what happens when a young person raised on legends finally decides the legend now belongs to her. What she does next will turn that decision into one of the most expensive bets Silicon Valley has ever made. She walks out of Stanford a dropout and into her parents' living room as if entering a boardroom. The degree is gone, but the pitch has never been sharper. There was a time when leaving a place like Stanford meant failure. In her story, it will mean destiny. She tells her family she isn't quitting school, she's upgrading missions. Stanford can make her successful. This company, she says, can make her significant. She will be the next great tech founder, only in healthcare, building an empire not of social media or search engines, but of life and death. One tiny vial of blood, hundreds of tests, real-time insight into the body. She isn't asking for permission. She is asking them to believe that their 19-year-old daughter is inevitable. On paper, the trade looks insane. She is walking away from a Stanford engineering degree, from a stable career path in pharma or academia, from the safety net of professors, grants, and tenure tracks. In exchange, she gets a tiny office near campus, second-hand lab benches, a handful of early employees who are young enough to still be assembling their own lives. No brand, no product, just a promise. It's an example of what happens when someone raised on Silicon Valley legends decides the most dangerous risk is being ordinary. But Holmes is not leaping into the void alone. She knows the real currency of Stanford is not the diploma, it's the network. Let me take you back to those office hours with Channing Robertson. The respected gray-haired professor who once graded her exams is now being pitched like a venture capitalist. She lays out her vision, the money to be saved, the power to be gained, the lives to be spared. Robertson does something rare for a tenured academic. He crosses the line. He joins her board, lends his name, and, more importantly, his credibility. Through Robertson and other Stanford connections, Holmes begins raising her first seed money. Older, wealthier men who would never gamble on a random teenager now see her framed by Stanford's halo. She isn't just smart, she is presented as inevitable. They write checks not only to fund a company, but to buy a front-row seat to what they're told is the future of medicine. The company's first name is blunt, almost naive: real-time cures. It promises everything. Cures in real time for everyone. Yet inside that little office, the vision quickly narrows. The broad medical ideas contract into one seductive, concrete claim: a device that can run vast panels of blood tests from a finger prick. Real-time cures quietly recedes. A sleeker, more mysterious name emerges: Theranos. From that moment, her life fuses with that word. Her identity, self-worth, and future are welded to a technology that does not yet exist. At times inspiring and at times chilling, this is the point where changing direction would mean admitting the dream itself is broken. And as the first money hits the bank account and the first hires walk through the door, one question hangs over everything. What happens when the dream refuses to match reality, but the empire must keep growing anyway? The dream hits the ground in a place that does not look like a $9 billion empire. It looks like a rented lab on a Palo Alto side street, a few benches pushed together, second-hand equipment humming in the corner, and whiteboards so crowded with equations that the walls feel like they're closing in. There was a time when Theranos is not glass towers and magazine covers. It is 6 or 7 people in hoodies and lab coats trying to bend physics before lunch. On those whiteboards, the promise is simple to write and nearly impossible to execute. Take a single drop of blood, run hundreds of tests, deliver instant, hospital-grade answers. Not only is that a massive engineering problem, it is a biochemical minefield. A tiny finger prick sample means almost no volume to work with, so every pipetting error, every vibration on the bench, every microscopic bubble gets amplified into noise. To run more tests, the team dilutes the sample, and with each dilution, the signal they need to measure thins out until it is barely distinguishable from background. The machine is supposed to see truth, where mathematically there is mostly static. Early hires feel that tension immediately. Young engineers from Stanford and Berkeley, chemists and lab scientists who have actually run clinical assays, Look at the requirements and quietly do the math. Some of what Holmes wants would challenge the best-funded research labs in the world. Other parts collide directly with known limits, detection thresholds, cross-reactivity, the way proteins and hormones behave when spread too thin. His story is one of relentless ambition. Theirs is one of calibration curves, quality controls, and FDA guidance documents. In meetings, a few of them say it out loud. This will take years of validation. The error rates are too high. Certain tests simply cannot be run accurately on that volume of blood. Holmes listens, nods, and then resets the clock. Deadlines move closer, not farther away. She talks about patients in rural clinics, soldiers on the battlefield, families who cannot afford to wait. The message is clear: move fast, break through, or someone else will get the money, the power, and the credit. Here's the pattern interrupt. While the lab is still wrestling with a single reliable assay, Holmes is already in conference rooms across town, hinting that Theranos can run dozens. Behind closed doors, the future product quietly becomes the present tense. Prototypes turn into platforms, early feasibility into capability. At times inspiring and at times chilling, it's an example of what happens when the story starts running ahead of the science and no one dares to pull it back. Inside the lab, instruments misfire, reagents expire, and data swings wildly from day to day. Outside, the pitch tightens, the slide decks sharpen, and the valuation curves bend upward. A gap is opening, small at first, between what the experiments can support and what Holmes is willing to suggest to investors, advisors, and retired generals who do not read assay validation reports. That gap will not stay small for long. Because once early partners start asking for live demos and real patients enter the picture, the modest benches and crowded whiteboards will no longer be able to hide what the machine can't do. And that is exactly when the money walks in. There was a time when Theranos is still just a cramped office, a few benches, and a dream held together with duct tape and optimism. Yet on paper, the story is irresistible. A teenage prodigy from a respectable family, a Stanford professor on the letterhead, and a promise to reinvent a multi-billion-dollar industry. To early investors, it looks less like a gamble and more like inevitability. Let me take you back to those first big checks. Tim Draper, the venture capitalist who watched Elizabeth grow up next door, does not need a lab audit to be impressed. He sees the black turtleneck, hears the low, deliberate voice, and hears echoes of another Silicon Valley empire builder. Family friends, former neighbors, people who once knew her parents at barbecues, lean in. They are not running blinded by poverty or desperation. They are moving on trust, on charisma, on the sense that getting in now means a lifetime of wealth and influence. In pitch meetings, the device itself is almost a supporting character. The star of the show is the market. Elizabeth talks about the global blood testing business, the hundreds of millions of tests run every year, the money wasted, the lives lost because results come back too late. Slides flash with huge numbers, world maps, and phrases like democratizing health and ending diagnostic uncertainty. The Edison's glitches, error rates, and temperamental behavior stay backstage, mentioned only as engineering challenges that will, of course, be solved soon. Channing Robertson sits beside her, or appears on the deck, like a seal of approval from the scientific priesthood. A senior Stanford figure, gray-haired, calm, reassuring. His presence says what the data does not. This is safe. This is serious. This is real. Other advisors add their names, their titles, their medals. Former cabinet members, retired generals, leaders who once commanded armies, now nodding along to a 19-year-old's vision of tiny blood vials. Because of their reputations, the company looks mature long before its technology is. With every signature, the stakes rise. Millions hit the bank account. Suddenly, there is payroll to meet, leases to pay, benefits to fund, and a growing headcount expecting progress. Engineers are hired, managers installed, PR firms engaged. The life of the company shifts from scrappy experiment to high-burn startup racing against the clock. Because of those expectations, every quarter without visible breakthroughs feels dangerous, so cosmetic progress starts to look almost as good as real progress. It's an example of what happens when the story outruns the science. In software, a glitchy beta can be patched tomorrow and pushed to users by noon. In blood testing, a glitch is a false cancer alarm, a missed heart attack, a real body on the line. Yet Elizabeth begins to treat biology like code, as if reality can be refactored on demand. The line between not ready yet and ready enough to show is about to blur. And once patients enter the picture, there will be no easy rollback. Once the line between not ready yet and ready enough to show blurs, something else starts to blur with it: the person drawing that line. There was a time when Elizabeth Holmes was just a nervous 20-something in a lab coat. Then, slowly, she began to disappear. Let me take you back to those early Theranos years when the experiments were failing. The data was fragile, and the company's future was anything but inevitable. Around that chaos, Holmes starts building something she can control: an image. The hoodies and Stanford sweatshirts are replaced by a uniform. Black turtleneck, almost every day. Dark blazer. Simple hair pulled back. The silhouette is unmistakable. It is a direct echo of Steve Jobs, a visual shortcut that whispers to investors and journalists: this is the next one. Not only a founder, but a myth in progress. The transformation doesn't stop at clothes. Former employees remember a different voice in the early days: higher, lighter, more in line with a teenager who skipped the normal path through life. Over time, that voice drops. Meetings, boardrooms, conference stages. The register is lower, the cadence slower, the diction strangely deliberate. It sounds older, more certain, almost hypnotic. To a room full of skeptical older men who control the money and the power, she no longer sounds like a college dropout asking for a chance. She sounds like the inevitable CEO of a future empire. Alongside the look and the sound comes the story. His story is one of oil and railroads. Hers is one of needles and blood. Holmes starts telling the same polished origin scene again and again. A childhood fear of needles, a beloved uncle lost too soon to cancer, the memory of watching him fade, the vow to spare other families that pain. It is at times inspiring and at times chilling, because the details are arranged with the precision of a pitch deck. Personal tragedy becomes a reusable marketing asset, deployed at conferences, in magazine profiles, in investor meetings where hundreds of millions of dollars are on the line. And it works. Journalists write breathless pieces about the ascetic young genius who wears one outfit, sleeps at the office, and wants to democratize healthcare, not chase wealth. Conference organizers put her on stage between former presidents and retired generals. Walgreens and Safeway executives see the turtleneck, hear the voice, absorb the story, and feel they are glimpsing the future of medicine. The myth hardens: a selfless visionary, ruthless with herself, gentle with patients, too mission-driven to lie. But here is the quiet problem. When a public identity becomes a carefully crafted character, what happens when the real data refuses to follow the script? As Theranos machines misfire and lab results wobble, The persona cannot admit weakness without cracking. It has to double down. It's an example of what happens when the performance outruns the product, and soon, the gap between Elizabeth Holmes and Elizabeth Holmes will demand a sacrifice. When the performance outruns the product, someone has to enforce the script. At Theranos, that role would not fall to a scientist or a seasoned doctor, but to a man who had never run a lab in his life. Let me take you back to 2002, years before the $9 billion valuation, before the black turtleneck became a uniform. Elizabeth Holmes is a teenager on a Mandarin immersion trip to China. On that trip is another student, not a classmate, but a man nearly 20 years older, Ramesh Sunny Balwani. He is charismatic, already wealthy from the dot-com boom, and he takes an interest in her life and her dreams. There was a time when this just looked like a strange friendship. It would become something far more consequential. His story is one of money without medicine. Balwani had made his wealth in software, not in blood testing. No medical degree, no background in biochemistry, no experience with clinical trials. Yet as Theranos grows, he drifts from the sidelines into the command center. By 2009, he holds the title of President and COO. He oversees operations, HR, finance, IT, even security. In a company built on a medical promise, the man running the day-to-day cannot legally draw your blood, but he can decide whether you still have a job. What the board does not know is that he is also Elizabeth's boyfriend. Their romantic relationship is kept off the org chart, off the minutes, and off the radar of those famous directors. No disclosure, no recusal, no awkward governance conversations. Just a private alliance at the top of the empire, the visionary founder in public, the ruthless enforcer in private. Together, they control hiring, firing, promotions, and information. If anyone inside hopes the board will act as a check, that hope quietly dies in the gap between what the board sees and what actually happens on the fourth floor. Inside Theranos, Sunny's influence is felt as fear. Employees receive aggressive emails at all hours, demanding impossible timelines and absolute loyalty. Question the accuracy of a test, raise a concern about a validation report, and suddenly security is watching who you talk to. Badge logs are reviewed. Conversations are monitored. People are marched out of the building with non-disclosure agreements pressed into their hands. It is an example of what happens when secrecy becomes a management style. The walls close in, and the truth has nowhere to go. At times inspiring, and at times chilling, this partnership creates a closed loop. She controls the story. He controls the people. She promises miracles to investors and partners. He pressures engineers and lab staff to make the numbers fit the promise. Together, they build a culture where loyalty outranks data, where fear beats ethics, and where the lie gains momentum with every unasked question. And once that machine is running, once 2 lives, a company, and billions in wealth are tied to a single narrative, stopping becomes more dangerous than speeding up. The next person who tries to pull the brake will discover just how far this alliance is willing to go to protect the story. Upstairs, the dream was alive. Glass walls, mood lighting, and those famous black turtlenecks moving through carefully choreographed demos where a single drop of blood promised to rewrite medical history. Investors, generals, former secretaries of state sat in sleek conference rooms watching slides about disruption, efficiency, and an empire of health data that would finally put patients in control. Downstairs, in the lab, the dream was bleeding out on the benchtops. There was a time when visitors were walked past a spotless showroom, shown a compact Edison device, and fed a story at times inspiring and at times chilling about democratizing healthcare. But behind badge-restricted doors, scientists were huddled over machines that refused to behave. The Edison would spit out wildly different numbers from the same sample. Controls failed. Calibration drifted. A test could read normal at 9 a.m. and life-threatening by lunch. To make anything look usable, lab staff reran tests again and again. If a batch came back with ugly outliers, those results were quietly discarded as anomalies. Quality control ranges that would horrify any regulated clinical lab were massaged, redefined, or simply ignored. It was an example of what happens when a company decides the story matters more than the statistics. Upstairs, slide decks claimed hundreds of assays from a finger prick. Downstairs, most tests were secretly run on modified commercial analyzers, fed with diluted fingerstick blood that those machines were never designed to handle. When the numbers came back off, the solution was rarely to halt testing. It was to adjust, reclassify, explain away. Because non-scientific executives held the real power, objections from the lab became background noise. Launch dates, Walgreens timelines, press announcements, and partnership milestones ruled the calendar. If a scientist said, "This assay isn't validated," an executive might answer, "We can't slow down the mission." If a quality report hinted at danger, the question was not, "Is this safe?" but, "Can this wait until after the demo?" Inside Theranos, two truths lived under one roof. One truth was polished and public. A revolutionary device, world-class accuracy, lives saved at scale, money and power flowing toward a new medical order. The other truth was buried in raw data, failed proficiency tests, and late-night emails begging for more time. Employees were coached not to be negative, warned that raising too many concerns meant they weren't a fit for the culture. Let me take you back to a pattern interrupt in this smooth narrative. In the middle of this pressure cooker, a few younger employees started quietly keeping their own mental ledgers. A Stanford grad named Tyler Schultz, working in the lab and seeing the gap between public claims and private chaos. A recent UC Berkeley graduate, Erica Cheung, watching quality controls fail while patient samples still went out the door. Their story is one of loyalty colliding with conscience. For now, they stayed, reran tests, tried to fix what they could. But the longer they lived inside those two truths, the more unsustainable the lie became, and the more dangerous it would be when someone finally refused to play along. Inside the lab, young scientists were watching controls fail. Outside, a very different scene was unfolding, a council of legends gathering around Elizabeth Holmes. Not only did Theranos have a miracle machine, on paper, it had something just as powerful in real life. A board of directors that looked like a small shadow government. There was a time when a single Theranos board meeting could have doubled as a reunion of American power. Henry Kissinger, the former Secretary of State and architect of Cold War diplomacy. George Shultz, another former Secretary of State with deep ties to Stanford and corporate America. James Mattis, a four-star Marine general who would later become Secretary of Defense. Alongside them, former senators, cabinet officials, admirals, and diplomats. Almost no one with deep clinical laboratory experience. Almost everyone with enormous prestige. To investors and partners, that lineup was its own kind of lab result. If these men, who had navigated wars, coups, and nuclear standoffs, trusted a 20-something dropout, then surely the technology had been vetted. Walgreens executives saw those names and felt reassured. Safeway's leadership saw those names and kept spending money on a partnership that never launched. Venture capital firms, family offices, wealthy heirs. Many skipped hard technical diligence because the board itself looked like proof. Let me take you back to those boardrooms. Dark wood, secure conference phones, presentations about how Theranos could decentralize diagnostics, change battlefield medicine, reshape healthcare in emerging markets. The conversations were high-level: strategy, partnerships, military applications, geopolitical influence. What they were not doing was a line-by-line review of validation data, assay performance, or failure rates on real patients. Holmes controlled what entered that room: slides with carefully chosen metrics, graphs that highlighted successes, buried caveats, and smoothed over volatility, demonstrations that relied on pre-selected samples and rehearsed talking points. She flattered their service, invoked national security, and framed Theranos as a patriotic project as much as a business. It was an empire of narrative, not of numbers. Because of that, the board's questions stayed within the frame she built. How fast can this scale? How do we get the Pentagon on board? Which heads of state should we brief next? They asked about competition, regulation, and global expansion, but not about proficiency testing failures or why so many tests still ran on hacked commercial machines in the back room. The absence of lab expertise meant they often did not even know which questions to ask. At times inspiring, and at times chilling, their story shows how power can be disarmed by a compelling story. These were not naive teenagers. They were men who had stared down dictators. Yet few demanded to see raw data, independent audits, or side-by-side comparisons with standard analyzers. How could so many seasoned figures fail to insist on basic proof that the core technology worked? It's an example of what happens when prestige replaces scrutiny, when reputation stands in for evidence. That fragile equilibrium would hold, right up until outsiders began asking the questions the board never had. That fragile equilibrium would hold, right up until a different kind of boardroom anxiety took over: the fear of missing out. There was a time when the biggest risk for a pharmacy chain wasn't bad tech. It was letting a rival get the headline first. Let me take you back to Walgreens in 2010-2011. Not only was it one of the largest drugstore chains in America, it was locked in a quiet arms race with CVS, racing to turn bland retail aisles into healthcare hubs. Minute clinics, flu shots, vaccinations. Whoever owned that space owned the future flow of money, prescriptions, and power. So when Theranos walked in promising hundreds of tests from a finger prick, executives didn't just see a gadget, they saw a weapon in a corporate war. Holmes and her team understood that perfectly. Negotiations were staged like theater. Demos took place on Theranos turf, using carefully selected samples, under tight supervision. Devices stayed closed, software screens were controlled, questions about error rates were redirected into visionary monologues about access and disruption. Walgreens' team asked for full validation data. What they got were polished slide decks, cherry-picked studies, and reassurances that detailed reports were coming soon. Yet the money flowed anyway. Walgreens agreed to a deal that would ultimately involve commitments in the hundreds of millions, exclusive rights, and plans to install Theranos wellness centers in thousands of stores. All this while, the company had never been allowed to take an Edison back to its own labs, crack it open, and run blind comparison studies against standard analyzers. It's an example of what happens when fear of a competitor outruns fear of being wrong. At the same time, another retail giant was being drawn into the orbit. Safeway, a grocery chain trying to reinvent itself as a destination for health, poured more than $100 million into building luxurious in-store clinics. New flooring, upgraded lighting, private consultation rooms, gleaming spaces just waiting for Theranos devices that kept not arriving. For years, these clinics sat mostly idle, a quiet monument to a promise that never quite materialized. Inside both companies, not everyone was dazzled. Pharmacists, lab consultants, and a few executives kept asking awkward questions. Why can't their own experts see the raw data? Why are key instruments hidden behind locked doors? Why are launch timelines always just a few months away? But those voices were often overruled by senior leaders who saw headlines, market share, and stock price upside. To them, the risk of saying no to a potential $9 billion empire of blood testing felt greater than the risk of trusting a secretive startup. And so the countdown began. Contracts signed, clinics built, launch dates circled on calendars. Long before the technology was truly proven, real patients would soon be walking into everyday retail stores, rolling up their sleeves, and trusting their lives to machines that might not work at all. What happened when the first results started coming back would expose far more than just bad science. Those first results didn't just come from a lab. They came from a box. The Edison sat there like an artifact from the future, a sleek, matte black cube, no blinking chaos of hospital monitors, just a soft glow, a single slot, a tiny screen. It was compact, quiet, and closed, the kind of machine that looked more like a luxury speaker than a medical device. To visitors, that was the point. No tangled tubes, no messy reagents, no visible blood. Just an elegant shell that promised to turn a few drops into life-saving answers. Inside, though, it was a different story. Behind the smooth panels were tangled wires, jerry-rigged cartridges, temperature swings, and half-finished engineering ideas fighting each other. Technicians joked that opening an Edison was like opening a junk drawer. You never knew what would fall out, but outsiders were never allowed to see that. The box stayed shut. The myth stayed intact. There was a time when every tour through Theranos followed the same choreography. A VIP would be ushered past security, down polished hallways, into a demo room where the black cube waited on a pedestal. A finger prick, a tiny vial, a dramatic pause. Then, as the Edison hummed theatrically, someone in the background quietly loaded a pre-run sample into a conventional analyzer, or queued up one of the few tests that the Edison could sometimes complete if everything was perfect. Minutes later, the result would appear on a screen linked to the cube, and the guest would nod, impressed. It looked effortless. It was anything but. Behind the scenes, most of the tests Theranos bragged about were being run on modified commercial machines from companies like Siemens. These analyzers were designed for full tubes of blood, not a droplet from a finger. So lab staff diluted the samples, stretched them, forced them through systems never meant to handle that volume. Accuracy suffered. Controls failed. But on slides and in pitch decks, it all collapsed back into one image. The Edison, the miracle box that supposedly did everything. Inside the lab, the romance died fast. Employees gave the Edison nicknames: the toaster, the magic 8-ball, the black coffin. They watched it misfire, stall, throw wildly inconsistent results, then watched executives wheel it out again for the next investor demo. His story is one of relentless belief. Theirs was one of relentless troubleshooting. At times inspiring and at times chilling, the contrast between the public empire and the private chaos wore people down. The Edison became more than a machine. It was a metaphor made of plastic and steel. A black box no one was allowed to open, both literally and figuratively. Questions about its performance hit a wall of secrecy, NDAs, and legal threats. Because of that secrecy, Because of that hunger for money and power without transparency, the entire company began to resemble its flagship device, glossy on the outside, unstable inside. And eventually, when that box started spitting out results in real pharmacies, real clinics, for real families, the illusion would collide with something even Theranos couldn't control: human lives. Let me take you back to the moment when those two worlds finally crashed into each other. There was a time when the promise of Theranos stopped being a pitch deck fantasy and stepped into fluorescent reality. Not in some elite hospital, but between aisles of shampoo and cereal, under a red and white Walgreens sign. Overnight, wellness centers began appearing in Arizona stores. Glass counters, sleek brochures, smiling faces on posters promising fast, affordable blood tests from a single finger prick. No needles, no vials, no waiting. Just a few drops, a tiny box in the back room, and answers. It sounded at times inspiring and at times chilling, because behind the marketing was a device that still behaved like a moody prototype. Let me take you back to one of those mornings. A woman in her 40s walks into Walgreens for a cholesterol check. She's healthy, jogs on weekends, no major family history. The Theranos test flags her for dangerously high levels, the kind that suggest she's a walking heart attack. Panic. Follow-up appointments. A traditional lab redraw. The new results come back normal. Her life swings from terror to confusion in a week, and the only thing she knows for sure is that one of those pieces of paper is lying. Another patient comes in for routine monitoring of a blood thinner. The Edison system spits out a reading that looks safe. In reality, his blood is far too thin. A conventional lab would have caught it. The finger prick fantasy does not. He walks around for days at risk of internal bleeding, carrying what he believes is scientific certainty in a neat Walgreens envelope. Inside the Theranos lab, the contrast is brutal. Technicians watch quality control samples go out of range again and again. Machines need constant recalibration. Runs are repeated, then quietly discarded when the numbers look wild. Yet the conveyor belt of real patient samples never stops. Because of that relentless push to hit rollout milestones and preserve the narrative of a working empire, bad data doesn't trigger a shutdown. It triggers more workarounds. His story is one of ruthless consolidation. Hers is one of ruthless optimism. Where regulated medicine demands that patient safety comes first, Theranos flips the order. Image, money, momentum, then maybe safety if it doesn't slow the launch. It's an example of what happens when a Silicon Valley growth mindset collides with a field where a single error can shatter a family. And yet, from the outside, nothing looks wrong. Walgreens employees are trained to smile, to mention how revolutionary this is, to point to the low prices. Customers line up because who wouldn't want more tests, more control, more power over their own health? Finally, somewhere in Arizona, another patient steps out into the parking lot. Receipt in one hand, Theranos results in the other. The numbers look official. The logo looks modern. The paper feels solid. What it says about their body might be dangerously wrong, and they have no idea. Inside Theranos, that piece of paper in the patient's hand is only the final link in a long chain of silence. From day one, new hires are dropped into a legal pressure cooker. Orientation doesn't start with a welcome lunch. It starts with a stack of non-disclosure agreements thick enough to feel like a small book. The message is blunt. Everything here is proprietary. Everything is secret. Talking about work with friends, with family, even with other people in the building is framed as a threat to the empire itself. Sign here, or there was a time when your badge simply never activated. Because of that wall of paper and fear, Most people never see the whole machine. Engineers are kept on one floor, lab scientists on another, business teams in polished conference rooms somewhere in between. Each group hears the same story about saving lives, about a world without big needles, but they rarely see each other's data. An engineer might spend months wrestling with a cartridge that keeps failing. A lab worker might notice wild swings in patient results. The sales team hears only about breakthrough accuracy. Silo by silo, the truth is chopped up until no one can quite prove what their instincts are already screaming. Over all of this hovers Sunny Balwani. His management style is not subtle. When deadlines slip or numbers disappoint, employees receive late-night emails that read less like coaching and more like legal notices. People are fired with no warning, called into a conference room, told to hand over their laptop, then escorted out by security as if they'd tried to steal bags of money. Internal communications are monitored. Badge swipes are logged. Even elevator chatter starts to feel dangerous. It's an example of what happens when power, paranoia, and secrecy are treated as core technology. Those who push back discover how ruthless the system can be. A young lab worker questions whether the Edison can meet federal lab standards. A scientist points out that proficiency testing is being done in ways regulators would never accept. Instead of gratitude, they get hostility. Meetings turn cold. Emails from lawyers arrive, quoting clauses of those NDAs. Criticism is recast as disloyalty. Whisper campaigns question their competence, their motives, even their mental health. At times inspiring and at times chilling, the mission to save lives becomes a shield to deflect every concern. So let me take you back to your own early 20s for a second. Imagine working at a world-famous unicorn, surrounded by retired generals, former cabinet secretaries, and billionaires who treat your CEO like the next Steve Jobs. Your stock options might be worth life-changing wealth. Your contract threatens ruin if you talk. Your badge data is tracked. How easy would it really be to walk away, to speak up, to tell the world the miracle isn't real? Because inside Theranos, a few people are about to try. And when they do, the company's response will reveal just how far this empire is willing to go to protect one lie. Inside that empire of secrecy, one of the first real fractures doesn't start with a rival or a regulator. It starts with a grandson. Tyler Schultz walks into Theranos with a last name that already carries power. His grandfather is George Shultz, former Secretary of State, Pillar of Washington, and one of Elizabeth Holmes's most prestigious board members. There was a time when getting a job at your grandfather's favorite company meant an easy ride. At Theranos, it feels like a mission. Tyler is young, idealistic, proud that his family is tied to a breakthrough that might change life for millions. Let me take you back to those early days in the lab. Tyler is assigned to the scientific core, the place where the miracle is supposed to be real, not just a story for investors. He sees the black boxes, the Edison machines, the rows of commercial analyzers hidden behind frosted glass. The message from above is relentless. This technology can run hundreds of tests from a finger prick, faster, cheaper, more accurate than anyone. At first, he wants to believe. Who wouldn't? Then he meets the numbers. On screen, the data looks nothing like the glossy claims. Quality control samples fail, then fail again. Results swing wildly from run to run. A patient sample measured on the Edison doesn't match the same sample measured on a standard machine. Instead of alarm, he hears rationalizations, outliers, instrument drift, growing pains. It's an example of what happens when a company decides the narrative matters more than the truth. The pattern intensifies. When Theranos runs validation studies, Tyler watches as bad data is massaged, reclassified, or quietly discarded. A test that should be pulled is pushed forward. A failure that should stop the line becomes a footnote in a slide deck. Because of the ruthless pressure to hit launch dates, to keep Walgreens happy, to protect the company's valuation, scientific caution turns into a liability. Tyler does something dangerous in that environment. He acts like a real scientist. He writes detailed emails to leadership, including Sunny Balwani. He lays out concerns about precision, about inaccurate thyroid tests, about quality control that would never pass in a normal clinical lab. The responses are not grateful. They are dismissive, then hostile. He is told he doesn't understand the full picture, that his analysis is wrong, that questioning the data is disloyal. Here, the story turns. His story is one of loyalty colliding with reality, of family pride grinding against numbers that refuse to behave. Tyler looks around and realizes the problem isn't a few bugs to be fixed with time and money. The system itself is built on hiding the truth, on silencing doubt, on presenting wealth and certainty to the outside world while the lab quietly burns. And that realization doesn't just put him at odds with Theranos. It puts him on a collision course with his own grandfather, with his own family name, and with an empire that has no intention of letting a 20-something scientist expose its lie. Tyler thinks he's alone, a lone skeptic staring at a billion-dollar mirage. But there was a time when another young employee was walking into the same building, staring at the same machines, and feeling a very different emotion at first. Her name is Erica Chung, fresh out of college, idealistic, hungry to do meaningful work. Theranos, to her, is not just a job. It's a mission, a chance to change human life by making blood tests faster, cheaper, less painful. The company's valued in the billions, backed by generals and secretaries of state, wrapped in the glamour of Silicon Valley wealth and power. For a 20-something scientist, it looks like the opposite of poverty. It looks like the future. Let me take you back to her first days in the lab. Erica spends her time where the magic is supposed to happen, running patient samples, loading tiny vials, logging results. The routine is tedious but important. Controls go in, numbers come out, data gets recorded. This is the quiet backbone of any medical empire. If the numbers are right, doctors trust the results. If the numbers are wrong, people bleed, but only metaphorically at first. Very quickly, the pattern begins. Machines throwing frequent error codes, quality control samples failing again and again, recalibrations happening not once a month, but multiple times a day. She watches technicians pull cartridges, shake them, tap them, put them back in like they're trying to fix a TV from 1993. The promise is cutting edge. The behavior looks more like improvisation. On paper, the rules are strict. If a control fails, the run is invalid. The data is rejected. That's how real labs protect patients. But in the Theranos lab, Erica is told something different. Ignore that failure. Don't log that one. Rerun the sample until the number looks acceptable. Not fix the underlying problem. Just keep pressing the button until the machine finally spits out a value that can be filed away as if nothing ever happened. It's an example of what happens when a company worships the appearance of precision more than precision itself. Because of the pressure to meet deadlines, to keep Walgreens happy, to keep the myth intact, the lab culture bends. Controls are treated as inconveniences, not warnings. The goal is not truth. The goal is throughput. At first, Erica tries to rationalize it. Maybe this is how high-growth startups operate. Maybe the genius is happening somewhere above her pay grade. But then comes the detail she can't escape. These aren't harmless internal experiments. These are real patient samples. Real people waiting on cancer markers, on medication levels, on answers that could change their lives. Her anxiety grows with every run. The more she learns about basic lab standards, the more she sees Theranos breaking them. Tyler is in one corner of the operation, buried in validation reports. Erica is in another, buried in day-to-day chaos. They barely know each other, yet their stories are tracing the same outline: a system that fails, a culture that hides it, and a leadership that demands silence. Two young scientists, same empire, same lie. And very soon, both of them will discover what happens when they refuse to play along. Two young scientists, same empire, same lie. But only one of them is about to walk straight into the line of fire. Let me take you back to the moment Tyler decides that quiet grumbling in the lab isn't enough. He goes home, opens his laptop, and starts doing the one thing Theranos fears most: putting concerns in writing. Not gossip, not hallway complaints. A formal complaint email addressed directly to Elizabeth Holmes and Sunny Balwani, spelling out, in cold, technical language, why the numbers don't add up. He lists failures on proficiency testing, unexplained result swings, instruments that behave one way during demos and another way with real patients. He points to regulatory landmines, CLIA rules about validation, quality controls that are being overridden, reports that could mislead doctors. Line by line, he is saying the unthinkable inside this $9 billion fairy tale. The data does not support the claims. There was a time when that kind of courage inside a young company might have earned respect. Here, it earned something else. Silence at first. Then, escalation. Instead of a technical meeting, Tyler is invited into a conference room with lawyers. The conversation shifts from hemoglobin and accuracy curves to non-disclosure clauses and proprietary information. They question his competence, his understanding of statistics, his grasp of complex systems. If the machines are off, maybe the operator is the problem. If he's uneasy, maybe he's not cut out for this level of innovation. It's an example of what happens when a culture that worships disruption meets someone who insists on boring, old-fashioned truth. Soon, the pressure hardens. He's presented with additional documents to sign, meant to further limit what he can say about what he's seen. The message is clear without anyone raising their voice. Sign, comply, fall back in line, or face consequences he can barely afford to imagine. Because remember who's on the board: former cabinet members, generals, and one of them is Tyler's own grandfather, George Shultz, a man whose life has been defined by public service and power at the highest levels. Tyler does something most 20-something scientists would never dream of. He goes to his grandfather and tries to blow the whistle across the dinner table. He lays out the failures, the reruns, the risks to patients. George listens, but the weight of reputation leans heavily toward Holmes, the charismatic founder who has charmed billionaires and heads of state. In that house, the empire speaks louder than family, at least at first. So Tyler hires his own lawyer. Not a corporate army, just one defender, paid from savings that were supposed to build his future, not protect him from it. He's facing potential lawsuits, surveillance, character attacks, the real possibility that he'll be branded difficult before his career even starts. All for insisting that a drop of blood should tell the truth. And then, picture this. After the meetings, after the arguments, after the calls with lawyers, he's alone in a modest apartment. No boardroom wood paneling, no security detail, no media glow. Just a laptop, a stack of legal papers, and a question hanging in the air. Does one young scientist keep fighting a $9 billion company backed by some of the most powerful people in America? Or does he finally walk away? The decision he makes next will not only shake Theranos, it will invite a new kind of enemy into his life. The new enemy does not arrive with lawyers or private investigators. He arrives with a notebook. John Carreyrou is not a billionaire, not a retired general, not a Silicon Valley kingmaker. He is an investigative reporter at the Wall Street Journal, known in quiet circles for something far more dangerous to a fragile empire than money or titles: patience. There was a time when a company could hide behind glossy press and soaring valuations. John's career is one long reminder that those days are never as safe as they look. Let me take you back to the moment Theranos leaves the world of breathless magazine covers and enters his life. It starts small. A skeptical pathologist, writing on a niche medical blog, keeps asking why this miracle machine has no peer-reviewed data, no detailed methodology, no FDA-cleared broad panels. At the same time, whispers begin to drift out of Palo Alto. Former employees hinting to friends that the story on CNBC does not match the story in the lab. One of those whispers finds its way to John. On paper, Theranos is untouchable. A $9 billion valuation. Walgreens deals. A board stacked with former cabinet members and military brass. Holmes, with her black turtleneck and baritone voice, is being hailed as the youngest self-made female billionaire, a once-in-a-generation founder whose life proves that wealth will follow vision. But when John starts looking, he notices what is not there. No published studies in major journals, no transparent clinical trials. A company claiming hundreds of tests from a finger prick of blood, yet offering very little anyone in his world would call evidence. Because of his background exposing corporate misconduct, he has seen this pattern before. Huge promises, extreme secrecy, and an almost religious insistence that doubt is betrayal. It's an example of what happens when power and narrative move faster than verification. So he begins quietly making calls to pathologists, to lab directors, to former contractors who touched Theranos on the edges and walked away uneasy. Very few want to talk. NDAs hang over them like storm clouds. Some mention private investigators. Others mention lawyers. The message is clear. This is a company that does not just protect its intellectual property, it protects its myth. At times inspiring, and at times chilling, the Theranos story has turned into a kind of civic religion in Silicon Valley, and heretics are not treated kindly. Weeks pass. Phone calls, dead ends, half sentences that trail off into silence. Then, finally, a break. John reaches a former Theranos employee who does not slam the door. The voice on the other end is cautious, measured, clearly scared. But when John asks the simplest question of all, does the technology work the way the company says it does? There is a pause, and then, quietly, an answer that does not match the press releases. In that moment, the $9 billion empire gains a new kind of problem. Someone with nothing to lose by asking what everyone else has been afraid to say out loud. There was a time when the most terrifying thing about Theranos wasn't a faulty blood test. It was an envelope, not a lab report, a letter. Heavy paper, famous letterhead, a name that made billionaires and presidents listen. David Boies, the attorney who helped win Bush versus Gore, who defended tobacco companies, who carried a reputation for courtroom warfare. When his firm stood behind Theranos, the $9 billion empire gained something even more potent than hype: a legal shield that looked untouchable. Because of that alliance, criticism stopped being a disagreement about science and started feeling like a threat to national security. Former employees would leave Theranos thinking they had escaped a strange, secretive world, only to discover that the world had followed them home. Investigators working for Boy's firm tracked them down, appeared at their doors, and handed over letters accusing them of stealing trade secrets, of betraying the company, of endangering a revolutionary mission. The message was clear: talk, and your life can be dismantled line by line, invoice by invoice, until the money runs out. Tyler Schultz felt it first inside his own family. He had tried to raise concerns quietly. He had gone to management. He had gone to Holmes. Nothing changed. When he finally reached out to regulators and then, cautiously, to John Carreyrou, Theranos' response was not to recheck the machines. It was to unleash the lawyers. Private investigators followed him. Letters demanded to know every journalist he had spoken to, every document he had touched. He was pressured to sign new confidentiality agreements that went far beyond a normal NDA, promising ruinous lawsuits if he ever revealed what he had seen. Imagine being in your 20s, with limited wealth, watching a company worth billions threaten to bury you under legal fees alone. That fear was the point. Others felt it too. Former lab workers were confronted in parking lots, visited at their new jobs, reminded of the contracts they had signed on their first optimistic day at a Silicon Valley unicorn. Inside Theranos, Holmes saw all of this not as ruthlessness, but as duty. Let me take you back to her mindset. In her story, the company was protecting fragile intellectual property from thieves and cynics. Trade secrets had to be guarded. Dissent had to be controlled. Any challenge was framed as an attack on patience, on innovation, on a world-changing mission that could not be slowed down by what she portrayed as petty, fearful critics. It's an example of what happens when power meets paranoia. When a leader is so convinced of destiny that every question looks like sabotage. Yet outside those conference rooms, something was shifting. A small group of insiders, already marked by investigators, watched the gap grow between the marketing and the reality. The letters were frightening. The threats were real. But the thought of staying silent while faulty tests reached real patients felt worse. Finally, they made a different calculation. The risk of speaking to Carreyrou was enormous. The risk of doing nothing was bigger. And once that decision is made, the legal empire Holmes built to keep the truth buried starts to face a new kind of enemy: the facts themselves. Once the decision is made to talk, the story stops being rumor and starts becoming evidence. That's where John Carreyrou lives. Not in the drama, but in the slow, relentless grind of verification. He doesn't rush in with a headline. He starts with a notebook and a pattern. Former employees from different teams, different years, different levels of access. He asks them the same questions in different ways, cross-checks dates, compares emails and lab records, lines their memories up against regulatory rules written in dry government language. There was a time when Theranos could wave away a lone critic as disgruntled. But when separate witnesses describe the same unsafe practices, the same fear, the same scripts from legal, it stops looking like a mistake and starts looking like a system. Carreyrou knows the company's empire is built on one central promise. The Edison box can run hundreds of tests from a single fingerstick. So he goes hunting for that machine in the place it should be most visible, the lab itself. Source after source describes a different reality. Commercial analyzers from Siemens and others doing the heavy lifting. Fingerstick blood diluted to make it compatible with machines designed for larger samples. The more he hears, the clearer the picture becomes. The miracle device is mostly a prop. The real work is being done by the very technology Theranos claims to have rendered obsolete. To test this, he compares internal procedures to what regulators expect. Controls out of range. Quality checks skipped or massaged. Results pushed out the door anyway because Walgreens stores are waiting and money is on the line. It's an example of what happens when marketing power outruns scientific truth and patients become data points in a pitch deck. Then comes the paper trail. Theranos has waved around glossy reports to investors and partners, implying that giants like Pfizer have validated the technology. Carreyrou gets copies. He talks to the pharma companies directly. Inside those documents, he finds logos that shouldn't be there, formatting that doesn't match, language that no one at Pfizer remembers writing. One internal memo, allegedly altered, quietly shifts cautious language into glowing endorsement. The contrast is almost darkly comic. A company worth $9 billion leaning on what looks, to a seasoned reporter, like a high school-level forgery. Behind every document, there is a person paying the price. Erica Chung has panic attacks before calls, replaying images of faulty lab runs in her head. Tyler Schultz feels his family name hanging in the balance, caught between loyalty to his grandfather and loyalty to the truth. They worry about private investigators, lawsuits, being crushed by a machine that has already intimidated people with far more wealth and power. Yet the guilt over possible patient harm keeps pulling them back to the phone. At times inspiring and at times chilling, their courage gives Carreyrou enough overlapping detail to see the full shape of the fraud. Finally, he sits with a nearly finished story that, if published, will accuse a Silicon Valley icon and her $9 billion darling of systemic deception. He knows Theranos has elite lawyers, a fearsome board, and friends in high places. What he doesn't yet know is how far they will go to stop the truth from ever reaching you. The story detonates on an ordinary morning. Phones light up, inboxes fill, and a Wall Street Journal headline cuts straight through the $9 billion illusion. Questions about Theranos' technology, about patient safety, about whether this miracle empire of blood testing is built on truth or on smoke. Not only is a Silicon Valley unicorn under attack, a carefully curated narrative of genius, disruption, and wealth is suddenly on trial. Let me take you back to that front page piece. It doesn't nibble at the edges, it goes for the core. The article lays out in calm clinical language that Theranos' Edison devices are barely used. Most tests, it says, are actually being run on commercial analyzers bought from traditional manufacturers, hacked with improvised modifications. Inside the labs, employees describe accuracy problems so severe that some results are thrown out altogether. Whistleblowers allege manipulated data, cherry-picked demos, and a culture where raising concerns is treated as betrayal. There was a time when a flattering magazine cover could silence doubt. This is not that time. The journal names former insiders, references internal emails, and hints at regulatory unease. It suggests that real patients may have received dangerously wrong results. For a company that promised to change the world, that single implication is radioactive. The reaction is immediate. In Silicon Valley, founders and venture capitalists send each other the link with a single line. Have you seen this? On Wall Street, analysts who once pitched Theranos as the future of diagnostics now stare at their screens, trying to reconcile glowing board resumes with allegations of faked validation. Walgreens and Safeway executives, who poured hundreds of millions into this dream, quietly call emergency meetings. And Elizabeth Holmes? She does not hide. Within hours, she is on television, in the trademark black turtleneck, voice low and steady. She calls the article false. She says it's written by a reporter with an agenda, by people who don't understand the technology, by sources with axes to grind. She insists Theranos runs hundreds of accurate tests on its own devices, insists regulators have seen the data, insists that, given time, the company will prove everyone wrong. It's an example of what happens when a powerful story collides with inconvenient facts. Some investors rush to her defense, praising her vision, attacking the media, reminding anyone who will listen that every great disruptor gets hit. Others, more quietly, begin asking for raw numbers, for independent reports, for something more than charisma and a promise. Here's the pattern interrupt. Nothing explodes overnight. A $9 billion myth does not evaporate with one article. At times inspiring and at times chilling, Holmes's public stance is unwavering. She tells the world Theranos will weather the storm, that this is just noise on the way to history. And for the moment, many still believe she just might. But belief can only hold back reality for so long. There was a time when regulators treated Theranos as just another ambitious lab in Silicon Valley clothing. One more startup promising to reinvent an old, boring industry. That illusion begins to crack when a quiet, bureaucratic name enters the story. CMS. The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services sound harmless, almost dull. In truth, they hold life and death power over every clinical lab in America. Their job is simple on paper and brutal in practice. Make sure that when a doctor orders a test, the number that comes back is real, reproducible, and safe enough that a human life can hang on it. They don't care about valuation, branding, or TED Talks. They care about controls, calibrations, and whether the machines in the back room actually work. So let me take you back to Theranos' Newark, California lab, far from the bright Walgreens counters and magazine covers. CMS inspectors walk in and start doing what they always do: pulling maintenance logs, checking quality control records, comparing procedures to what federal law requires. What they find is not a visionary empire of science. It is chaos dressed up as innovation. Quality control samples are failing, yet patient testing continues. Critical instruments are not properly calibrated. Technologists are running assays they are not qualified to oversee. In one report, CMS will eventually write that Theranos' practices pose immediate jeopardy to patient health and safety. Regulator language for a 5-alarm fire. Behind the glass walls and sleek devices, real people's results are being generated in a way that no serious lab would tolerate. At the same time, another 3-letter agency is quietly undermining the myth. The FDA, which regulates medical devices, has only ever cleared a single Theranos test, a narrow herpes simplex virus assay run on a fingerstick sample. That's it. Not the sweeping panels for cancer, cholesterol, and dozens of other conditions that Holmes implies are all validated. On paper, the miracle machine is legally authorized to do one small thing, while in public, it is presented as doing almost everything. Yet even when the gap between perception and reality is this wide, the system does not slam on the brakes overnight. Because of how American regulation works, there is a process: inspection findings, formal deficiency citations, warning letters. Theranos is given chances to respond, to submit corrective plans, to promise that the problems are being fixed. Lawyers draft replies, consultants prepare binders, meetings are held. All the while, the lab keeps running tests and patients keep walking in, trusting the numbers. It's an example of what happens when a slow, rules-bound machine collides with a fast, story-driven company. CMS is not built for viral hype. It is built for paperwork and due process. But once those inspectors put in writing that Theranos endangers patients, the narrative shifts. This is no longer about visionary risk-taking or the harsh realities of startup life. It is about legal liability, regulatory sanctions, and waiting just beyond the horizon, the possibility of criminal charges. Once the government labels you a danger to patients, the empire does not just wobble, it starts to crack. The same bureaucracy that had once seemed slow and distant now moves with cold precision, and for Theranos, the first real blow lands in Newark, California. CMS issues its decision. Theranos' license to operate its Newark lab is revoked. Not suspended, revoked. Inspectors describe conditions so unsafe that regulators take the rare extra step of banning Elizabeth Holmes herself from owning or operating a clinical lab for 2 years. For a company that had bragged about running hundreds of tests from a single drop of blood, this is not a paperwork issue. It is a death sentence for the core business, written in the language of federal law. There was a time when Walgreens executives saw Theranos as their ticket to beating CVS. They poured money into glossy wellness centers, carved out prime real estate in Arizona stores, and wrapped their brand around Holmes's promise. Now, those same executives read the CMS report and see something else: liability, lawsuits, and headlines they do not want. Quietly at first, Walgreens suspends all Theranos testing in its pharmacies. Then the suspension becomes a termination. The partnership is ripped up, in-store testing centers are shut down, and the signage that once announced a medical revolution is peeled off the walls. Walgreens does not just walk away, it sues. The company accuses Theranos of breach of contract and demands hundreds of millions back. For a startup that once boasted a $9 billion valuation, the legal filing is a brutal translation of hype into hard numbers. Here is what your promises cost us. Here is the money we want returned. Safeway moves even more quietly. Years earlier, its leadership had spent hundreds of millions remodeling stores, building high-end clinics near the produce aisles, betting that Theranos machines would turn grocery runs into health checkups. But the devices never arrived in reliable form. Deadlines slip. Demos fail. Excuses pile up. Eventually, without a public breakup or dramatic press release, Safeway writes off the investment. The clinics are mothballed or repurposed, a silent monument to a technology that never delivered. Inside Theranos, the mood turns from missionary zeal to siege warfare. Labs close. Layoff rounds hit engineers, lab workers, even longtime loyalists. Desks sit empty, badges stop working, and the once crowded offices of a unicorn now echo with the sound of cardboard boxes sliding across desks. Yet in the shrinking inner circle, denial still has power. Some insist the company can pivot to software or license intellectual property, or finally fix the machine if given just a little more time and money. Let me take you back to those early days when Holmes was compared to Steve Jobs, when her story is one of at times inspiring and at times chilling ambition, and ask a simple question. How many people in those rooms now admit, even to themselves, that the miracle never worked? Because as Theranos faces regulatory bans, partner lawsuits, and a rapidly vanishing runway, the full legal reckoning has not yet arrived. That comes next, and it will reveal something even darker than broken deals. That darker part begins when the story stops being about a failing startup and starts being about potential crime. Not just missed projections or broken dreams, but the question regulators ask when billions of dollars and real human lives are on the line. Was this failure or was this fraud? There was a time when Theranos was simply a Silicon Valley embarrassment, another overhyped unicorn that flew too close to the sun. But as whistleblower documents, internal emails, and lab data pile up, the Securities and Exchange Commission quietly moves in. Investigators start reconstructing the empire Holmes built. Slide decks promising revolutionary technology, revenue forecasts in the hundreds of millions, claims of FDA clearances that, on closer inspection, look partial, conditional, or imagined. The SEC focuses on the money. Who was told what, and when. They examine glossy investor binders that say Theranos devices are deployed on military helicopters, that big pharmaceutical companies have validated the technology, that revenue is already flowing from major contracts. Then they compare that to reality. No battlefield deployment, limited or negative pharma studies, and a company burning cash, not generating it. It's an example of what happens when marketing language is treated as legal truth. As the SEC builds its civil case, another agency starts circling, one with sharper teeth. The Department of Justice opens a criminal investigation, and suddenly the language changes from misstatements to wire fraud and conspiracy. Prosecutors look at every email, every investor call, every patient whose blood was run on machines insiders knew were unreliable. Because if Theranos used interstate wires to send doctored reports, falsified validation letters, or inflated financials, that is not just bad judgment. That is potentially a federal crime. Here, the media turns too. Let me take you back to those early magazine covers. The black turtleneck, the deep voice, the breathless comparisons to Steve Jobs. Now the same outlets publish timelines of alleged deception, annotated PDFs of altered pharmaceutical reports, side-by-side quotes showing how Holmes assured partners the technology was ready, while internal scientists warned of catastrophic error rates. The narrative of a visionary founder chasing a dream is replaced by a forensic audit of knowingly false statements. Under pressure, Theranos tries to contain the damage. Holmes reaches a settlement with the SEC without admitting or denying wrongdoing. She agrees to relinquish control, give up her majority voting shares, accept a long ban from serving as an officer or director of a public company, and pay fines that, compared to her paper wealth, look almost symbolic. Publicly, she insists she never intended to mislead anyone, framing her life as a story of ambition gone wrong rather than deliberate deceit. But the pattern interrupts when the DOJ stops negotiating and starts charging. Federal prosecutors announce criminal indictments against Elizabeth Holmes and Sunny Balwani, alleging multiple counts of wire fraud and conspiracy to defraud both investors and patients. For the first time, the mythic founder who once charmed billionaires and former cabinet members must answer not just to journalists and angry partners, but to a judge, a jury, and the full weight of the United States government. There was a time when Elizabeth Holmes controlled the narrative. Now, in a federal courtroom, her life and freedom depend on rewriting it one last time. Not as the ruthless architect of a $9 billion lie, but as something far more sympathetic, a visionary who believed too much. Her legal team builds everything on that core claim. She did not intend to defraud. She believed the Edison would work, believed the engineers would solve the problems, believed that if Theranos could just survive a little longer, reality would finally catch up to the story. In this version, the fake demos, the cherry-picked data, the secret use of commercial analyzers are not the tools of a con artist, but the desperate measures of a founder trying to keep the lights on until the breakthrough arrives. To make that believable, the defense leans hard on context. Let me take you back to the image they present. A 19-year-old college dropout, a young woman in a world dominated by older men with money and power, walking into boardrooms filled with former cabinet members, generals, billionaires. The pressure is constant, the expectations escalating. Every headline compares her to Steve Jobs. Every investor wants hockey stick growth, flawless demos, no doubts. In that environment, they argue, optimism is not a flaw. It is the price of admission. Because of that framing, her lawyers talk less about fraud and more about fear. Fear of losing investors. fear of disappointing a board that includes a former Secretary of State, fear of being exposed as just another startup that promised too much and delivered too little. It's an example of what happens when Silicon Valley's culture of "fake it till you make it" collides with medicine, where human bodies do not care about pitch decks. Then they add another layer: Sunny Balwani. Holmes testifies that her former boyfriend and COO was not just a partner, but an abusive, controlling presence. She describes a man who monitored her messages, dictated her schedule, criticized her body, and demanded absolute loyalty. In her telling, he helped create the toxic culture, pushed impossible launch timelines, and influenced key decisions about hiding failures and pressuring employees. The subtext is clear. She may have been CEO on paper, but inside the empire, someone else was pulling many of the strings. This creates a deliberate tension. The prosecution calls her a powerful mastermind. The defense invites jurors to see a vulnerable victim, shaped and sometimes manipulated by the very man now facing his own trial. Can someone be both? At times inspiring, and at times chilling, that dual image asks the jury to separate intent from outcome. If she truly believed the technology would work, are the lies still crimes, or just the tragic excesses of belief? The stakes are brutal. If jurors accept that she believed her own story, they may hesitate to brand her a criminal and send her to prison. But if they see a consistent pattern of deliberate misrepresentation, of calculated half-truths told to protect wealth and power, then the myth of Elizabeth Holmes doesn't just fail. It collapses into fraud, and the next phase of this story becomes not about vision, but about punishment. And then the vision meets reality, not in a boardroom or a TED stage, but under fluorescent lights, with a jury watching every breath. The myth of the $9 billion empire is dragged into a cramped courtroom, and the first cracks appear not through dramatic speeches, but through calm voices describing everyday work that went terrifyingly wrong. Let me take you back to the witness stand, where a young former lab worker, Erica Chung, sits facing Elizabeth Holmes. There was a time when Erica believed the story too. She joined Theranos thinking she was helping reinvent medicine. Instead, she tells the jury about machines that failed quality control day after day, results that swung wildly, and a culture where bad data was not a problem to be solved, but an inconvenience to be buried. When tests didn't match, they were rerun until something acceptable appeared. When she raised concerns, she was warned she was not being a team player. The message was clear: protect the company, not the patients. Her story is one of quiet fear. She describes late-night emails, meetings where questions were brushed aside, and the constant, unspoken threat that speaking too loudly could end a career. In a company awash in theoretical wealth and future money, the people in the lab lived with a different reality: instruments that malfunctioned, reports that didn't add up, and supervisors who hinted that if results looked bad, the machines, not the technology, must be at fault. Then the focus shifts. Investors take the stand, men and women used to reading balance sheets, not fairy tales. They recount glossy presentations that projected hundreds of millions in revenue, charts implying military contracts, and slides suggesting that regulators were already on board. One investor explains that Theranos claimed its devices were being used on medevac helicopters. Another describes how Holmes spoke of partnerships with Walgreens and Safeway as if they were fully proven, nationwide successes, not fragile pilots held together by secrecy and hope. Because of those claims, tens of millions of dollars flowed in, reinforcing the illusion of unstoppable momentum. But money was only half the story. Doctors and patients follow, and the room changes temperature. A physician explains how a Theranos result suggested a patient was on the verge of organ failure, only for standard labs to show normal levels. A woman describes being told her HCG levels indicated a possible miscarriage, living through days of panic, then learning later that her pregnancy was healthy and the Theranos test was wrong. Their lives, their families, their medical decisions were shaped by numbers that looked precise but rested on sand. As they speak, prosecutors project internal emails and altered reports on giant screens. Validation studies with inconvenient outcomes quietly removed. Logos of pharmaceutical companies placed on documents in ways that implied endorsements that never existed. Side by side, the jury sees what Holmes was told in private and what she said in public. The gap is not a rounding error. It is a canyon. Finally, the prosecution leans in on the theme it has been building for weeks. This is not, they argue, the story of a naive optimist who flew too close to the sun. It's an example of what happens when image outruns truth, when power and hype demand results that reality cannot deliver. To keep the money coming, to keep the empire standing, misrepresentation became routine, then expected, then required. And as jurors listen, one question hangs in the air. If this was the pattern on the surface, what would the deeper layers of Theranos reveal next? Those deeper layers finally surface in a very different room. No lab coats, no glossy pitch decks, just a federal courtroom in San Jose, fluorescent lights humming, wooden benches packed, and 12 jurors filing back in with the power to decide whether this entire story was ambition gone wrong or a criminal empire built on lies. There was a time when Elizabeth Holmes walked into rooms and everyone else went quiet. Now, as the clerk announces that the jury has reached a verdict, the silence has a different weight. Outside, cameras form a wall. Reporters live tweet every breath, but in here the rules are simple. All rise. Holmes stands, hands clasped, face still. The same black turtleneck aesthetic, the same controlled posture, but the stakes have finally caught up. Count by count, the foreperson reads. Guilty on several charges of wire fraud and conspiracy to defraud investors. Not guilty on some of the counts tied directly to patients. No verdict on a few others. Hung jury. Legal gray zones that leave room for argument. It's a mixed outcome on paper, yet the message is unmistakable. The grand narrative that money and vision excuse everything has just been punctured, in public, under oath. Because of the way the charges are carved up, lawyers will spend years debating what this means. Investors were recognized as victims. Patients, at least in the formal verdict, less so. It's an example of what happens when the law tries to map clean lines onto a mess of hype, negligence, and human life. But to the people who watched their savings vanish or their test results swing wildly, the distinction feels academic. Months later, sentencing day arrives. The courtroom is full again, but the mood has shifted from suspense to reckoning. Prosecutors argue for a long sentence, pointing to hundreds of millions raised on false claims, to forged reports, to a media machine that turned a 19-year-old dropout into a paper billionaire. The defense leans on her age, her newborn child, the claim that she still believes in the mission. The judge listens, then hands down more than 11 years in prison, plus restitution obligations that dwarf any realistic future paycheck. For someone once celebrated as the youngest self-made female billionaire, the symbolism is brutal. Wealth on paper has become years behind bars. Power in Silicon Valley has become supervised release, restitution schedules, and Bureau of Prisons intake forms. Dryly put, the market has finally corrected. Outside, reactions split. Some say justice. a rare case where a high-profile founder actually goes to prison, unlike executives in other corporate scandals that wiped out far more money. Others argue the punishment is too harsh, that this is selective outrage aimed at a woman who played the same ruthless game as her male peers. The debate reveals something uncomfortable about how society prices deception, depending on who commits it and who gets hurt. Then, one more walk. Holmes exits the courthouse flanked by lawyers, not admirers. No triumphant stride, no stage-managed product demo, just a convicted felon stepping into a future of appeals, prison visits, and limited choices. His story is one of rise and fall. Hers, at times inspiring and at times chilling, now turns from the spotlight of celebrity to the fluorescent quiet of a cell. And yet, as those doors close behind her, another question opens. What will Silicon Valley learn from this, if anything at all? There was a time when saying you were in on Theranos felt like a status symbol. Not only were you backing a visionary founder, you were, on paper, buying a front-row seat to the future of medicine. The names alone sounded untouchable. Rupert Murdoch, the media tycoon who had seen every kind of pitch. The Walton family, heirs to the Walmart empire and masters of squeezing profit from every inch of a supply chain. Betsy DeVos's family office, steeped in political power and money. Add in Carlos Slim, Mexican telecom billionaire, and a parade of wealthy heirs, former executives, and dynastic families, and the total swelled into hundreds of millions of dollars. This was not naive retirement money. This was so-called smart money, and it rushed in. But let me take you back to how that money actually moved. Many of these checks did not come through the usual Sand Hill Road gauntlet of term sheets, technical partners, and lab coat due diligence. They came through warm introductions at private dinners, through family friends, through lawyers and wealth managers who knew someone on the Theranos board. A retired general would call an old colleague. A former cabinet member would whisper that this young woman was the real thing. Instead of venture capitalists tearing apart the science, there were family offices and media moguls taking comfort in who else was at the table. Because the psychology was powerful. FOMO was doing half the fundraising. This was the age of unicorns, of Facebook and Uber minting fortunes overnight. And here was a rare female founder in a male-dominated world, promising not a delivery app, but a revolution in life and death. To say no was to risk missing the next Steve Jobs, the next Rockefeller of healthcare. Doubts that might have killed a smaller deal were rebranded as not getting it. For people who had spent a lifetime winning, that was a hard label to accept. Then came the social proof, stacked like armor around the lie. Henry Kissinger, George Shultz, James Mattis, former senators and secretaries of state sitting on the board, lending their reputations as collateral. Walgreens and Safeway circling with retail deals. When that many stars orbit the same object, questioning whether the core technology even works can feel almost irrational, even rude. His story is one of ruthless conquest. Hers, at times inspiring and at times chilling, shows how prestige can silence basic questions like, can we see the raw data? And that raises an uncomfortable thought. If billionaires, generals, and political dynasties can be swept up by a good story, what chance does anyone else have? It's an example of what happens when narrative outruns evidence, when wealth and power mistake access for insight. In the next chapter, the focus shifts to the people who did ask questions and what it cost them to keep asking. Those people who kept asking questions ran into a much bigger problem than hurt feelings or awkward board meetings. They ran into a culture that had turned a motivational slogan into a business model. In Silicon Valley, there was a time when Fake it till you make it sounded almost noble. A way to drag the future into the present by sheer force of belief. Founders painted grand roadmaps, promised features that were still on whiteboards, and talked about user numbers they hoped to reach, not numbers they had yet. Investors expected it. Employees laughed about vaporware. In software, if the app crashed or shipped with bugs, a patch went out the next week, and life went on. No one ended up in the emergency room because a photo filter failed. But Theranos wasn't selling photo filters. It was selling certainty about the blood in a person's veins. That difference is where the usual startup story, at times inspiring and at times chilling, veers into something darker. With medical diagnostics, a wrong result is not an inconvenience. A false negative can send a cancer patient home unwarned. A false positive can push someone into panic, into unnecessary procedures, into debt. Legally and ethically, the line is not mysterious. Optimism is allowed. Even aggressive projections are allowed. The moment a founder knowingly misrepresents what the product can do today, alters data to hide failures, or quietly uses real patients as unwitting test subjects, that optimism turns into deception. When those lies are fed to regulators, partners, and the public, the empire being built is not just ambitious, it is fraudulent. Theranos crossed every one of those thresholds. Internal lab reports were polished and doctored to look like independent pharmaceutical validations. Devices that failed in-house were hidden behind glossy demos, while most real tests were secretly run on modified commercial analyzers in the back room. Investors were told the Edison machines were running hundreds of assays on a single drop of blood. In reality, many tests needed full venous draws and traditional equipment. Because of those choices, patients at Walgreens locations became test subjects without consent. Results swung wildly, terrifying some people with fake diagnoses, while reassuring others who were actually sick. Regulators were misled with cherry-picked data, critical failures were buried, and whistleblowers inside the lab were threatened rather than heard. It's an example of what happens when the story of the future is treated as more important than the truth of the present. So where does vision end and fraud begin? In healthcare, it ends the moment a leader looks at a broken machine, a bad data set, a dangerous result, and decides to ship anyway. Ambition isn't the problem. Many great advances in medicine began as impossible dreams. The problem is lying about what the machine can do right now, today, while real lives hang in the balance. Because once fake it till you make it meets blood, regulators, and frightened patients. The next question becomes chilling. Who, exactly, is being experimented on? And what happens when they finally find out? And here's the uncomfortable part. Theranos didn't grow in a vacuum. It grew in a culture that rewarded exactly what Elizabeth Holmes was selling. Not evidence, not working machines, a story. There was a time when the ultimate Silicon Valley flex wasn't profit or patents, it was the size of the dream. Founders were praised for promising to disrupt trillion-dollar industries, to save the world with code and hardware, to build an empire on a pitch deck and a TED-style speech. Holmes stepped onto that stage with the perfect script. A teenage prodigy from Stanford, a single drop of blood, hundreds of tests, cheaper, faster, for everyone. Life, death, and wealth, all wrapped into one clean narrative. The media loved it. Not only was she a charismatic founder, she was a unicorn in another sense. A rare female tech CEO in a field dominated by men. Magazine covers put her in black turtlenecks, framed her as the next Steve Jobs, and repeated her claims as if they were already history. When skeptics whispered that the science didn't add up, Defenders could frame it as an attack on a woman finally breaking into the boys' club. Criticism, at times, was painted as sexism, which made some journalists and investors hesitate just long enough for the illusion to harden. In that world, disruption wasn't just a buzzword, it was a moral shield. Breaking rules was celebrated. Moving fast and breaking things sounded edgy in social media. Applied to blood tests, it became lethal. Regulators, whose job is to ask slow, boring, necessary questions, were cast as obstacles to innovation. Holmes leaned into that narrative. Government was old. She was the future. Who wants to be the person who slows down the future? But there was another, quieter ingredient: ignorance. Many of the people around Holmes were brilliant at money and power, but not at biochemistry. Former cabinet secretaries, retired generals, billionaires sat on her board, men who knew war and geopolitics, but not assay validation or lab controls. Many investors and reporters lacked the scientific literacy to press on the right details, so phrases like proprietary microfluidics and nanotainers floated by unquestioned. It sounded advanced. That was enough. Then, pattern interrupt. How many other companies right now are running on the same fumes? Slick decks, heroic founders, opaque technology, and a chorus of cheerleaders chanting disruption, while almost nobody understands what's actually inside the box. Holmes's story is one of ambition, deception, and a system eager to be deceived because the myth felt so good. It's an example of what happens when hype outruns knowledge, when status substitutes for due diligence, when a culture worships the narrative more than the numbers. And as Theranos collapses in hindsight, one question hangs over every glowing profile and every breathless valuation. Was this an anomaly, or a preview of cracks that haven't yet been exposed? Behind that question is something even darker, because this wasn't just a story about valuation charts and boardroom egos. This was a company that reached into people's veins, printed numbers on lab reports, and told them what was happening inside their bodies. When those numbers were wrong, the damage didn't show up on a balance sheet. Let me take you back to a woman in Arizona who walked into a Walgreens, rolled up her sleeve, and paid for what she thought was cutting-edge science. Days later, her Theranos report flagged a positive result for HIV. In a few lines of text, her life split in two. She replayed every relationship, every mistake, every future plan, now drenched in fear. Then came the follow-up tests at a traditional lab, the waiting room panic, the sleepless nights. The result? Negative. The earlier horror had been a ghost, conjured by a machine that never worked as promised. There was a time when another patient, a middle-aged man, trusted those same tiny vials. His Theranos results showed wildly abnormal values, numbers that suggested serious organ problems. Doctors, acting in good faith, ordered invasive follow-up scans, specialist visits, more blood, more money, more dread. Finally, conventional labs showed his levels were normal. The crisis had been manufactured out of thin air, yet the emotional bill was very real. Weeks of believing his body was failing, his family bracing for impact. Inside the company, the toll looked different, but no less brutal. Young scientists who had joined to change the world realized they were part of an empire of illusion, watching their work massaged, deleted, or ignored whenever it conflicted with the myth. Some left with panic attacks, some with depression, some with the heavy private knowledge that their silence might have put real people at risk. Because of that ruthless internal culture of secrecy and intimidation, the guilt did not end when their paychecks did. And when a medical dream turns out to be a mirage, trust evaporates far beyond one brand. Patients who lived through Theranos' chaos now approach new tests, new devices, new revolutions with a flinch. It's an example of what happens when hype hijacks healthcare. The next legitimate breakthrough has to climb over the wreckage of the last lie just to be heard. Around the edges were quieter victims. Small investors who weren't billionaires or former secretaries of state, but dentists, retired engineers, local business owners who believed in Holmes's mission and watched life savings disappear. Employees who poured their 20s into Theranos, only to emerge with resumes stained by scandal and careers knocked off course. Families dragged into subpoenas, depositions, and legal fees, their private lives consumed by a fraud they never designed. His story is one of money and power. Hers is one of image and illusion. Both are, at times, inspiring and at times chilling. But the Theranos chapter comes with a final, somber reminder. Every headline about billions lost hides, quieter lines that never trend. A woman alone with a false diagnosis. A man preparing for a disease he never had. A former employee staring at the ceiling at 3 a.m., wondering whether speaking up earlier could have changed any of it. There was a time when the Theranos story could have ended as a quiet footnote instead of a courtroom drama. Same founder, same dream of a painless drop of blood, but a completely different empire. Let me take you back to those early Stanford years. Imagine a version of Theranos that never chased 200 tests from a single finger prick, never promised to revolutionize every Walgreens in America. Instead, it picks 3 or 4 assays, maybe warfare and monitoring, maybe a single infectious disease panel. The company spends years buried in clinical trials, slogging through FDA submissions, begging for peer reviewers instead of magazine covers. Slower wealth, less glamour, but real medicine. In that alternate life, the engineers and scientists are not props in a pitch deck. They are the brakes. When an assay fails, launch dates move, not reference ranges. A lead scientist can walk into a board meeting, lay down a stack of ugly data, and say, "This is not ready," without expecting a security escort by the end of the week. It is tedious, expensive, and humiliating at times, but the machine either works under scrutiny or it doesn't leave the lab. Picture another fork in the road. The moment Holmes realizes the Edison will never do what the slide decks promise. In our world, that realization triggered more secrecy, more intimidation, more elaborate explanations about proprietary technology. In The Road Not Taken, she does something far more dangerous to her image and far safer for patients. She admits it. She rebrands Theranos not as a retail testing empire, but as a research platform, a company that builds prototypes and then partners transparently with established labs like Quest or LabCorp, instead of trying to destroy them. That version of the story is still ambitious, still hungry for money and power, but the lie shrinks. The sales pitch becomes, "Help us develop the next generation of analyzers," not, "We've already built them and put them in Walgreens." Investors get a slower path to wealth, fewer glossy profiles, more boring quarterly updates about calibration curves and error bars. So why did none of that happen? Because once the $9 billion valuation arrived, once former secretaries of state and generals were nodding along, the gravity changed. Investor expectations, media pressure, and the intoxicating narrative of the young woman in the black turtleneck created a cage. Her story is one of identity welded to myth. To back down meant not just losing money, but losing the self she had spent a decade performing. It's an example of what happens when a founder oversells early and then discovers that every correction feels like confession. Each small exaggeration demands a bigger one to cover it. Each missed milestone demands a new, more ruthless promise. And by the time anyone realizes the road not taken was safer, that road is gone. But if the road was gone for Holmes, it was still very much open for the people around her, and the way they responded to that pressure would decide who became a whistleblower and who became a co-conspirator. Those choices inside Theranos did not happen in a vacuum. They happened in a moment when Silicon Valley discovered medicine, and suddenly the most intimate parts of human life looked like the next great frontier for money and power. There was a time when medical breakthroughs came from slow, methodical labs and gray-haired researchers. Now the breakthroughs are promised by 20-something founders with pitch decks, AI models, and a runway measured in months. AI diagnostics that claim to read cancers in scans, at-home tests that promise hospital-level accuracy from a bathroom counter, wearables that whisper about your heart, your sleep, your future. The potential is enormous. So is the temptation to promise just a little more than the data can support. Because once investors are told that an algorithm can outperform a doctor, that a drop of blood can replace a lab, or that a wristband can predict disease before symptoms, the pressure begins. Pressure to smooth the curves, to round up the accuracy, to call a prototype a product. It's an example of what happens when the culture of move fast and break things collides with a world where breaking things means real patience. Let me take you back to another set of quiet rooms, far from Theranos. A mental health app claims to diagnose depression from voice patterns. A remote monitoring startup says its sensor can spot sepsis hours earlier than nurses. A triage chatbot is deployed in national health systems, nudging people toward or away from the emergency room. Many of these tools live in a regulatory gray zone. They are software, not scalpels, so they slip past the strict device rules, even when their recommendations steer life and death decisions. Regulators are trying to catch up, but the gaps are obvious. Some AI tools are cleared on narrow, retrospective data sets, then quietly rolled out to millions. Others rebrand themselves as wellness instead of medical, sidestepping deeper scrutiny while marketing to worried families who assume someone, somewhere, checked the claims. And already, there have been warning shots. Algorithms that underdiagnosed certain racial groups, wearables whose heart readings dropped in accuracy for people with darker skin tones, at-home COVID tests that reached the market before their real-world performance was fully understood. Each controversy was smaller than Theranos, but each raised the same question. Were claims racing ahead of validation? Investor appetite has not faded. The hunt is on for the next Theranos in the flattering sense, a company that transforms diagnostics, conquers $1 trillion market, and finally makes that empire of health data pay off, only this time without the fraud. But the incentives remain ruthless. Founders are rewarded for bold timelines, heroic promises, and glossy narratives long before the science is settled. So imagine a future scandal in an era of AI-driven medicine. Not a black box in a Walgreens backroom, but a cloud system quietly embedded in hospitals worldwide, auto-approving or denying treatments. Imagine it trained on flawed data, drifting over time, never fully revalidated. Who would be most at risk? The same people who always are when systems fail. The poor, the uninsured, the ones without a second opinion. His story is one of how a single lie can scale with technology. Holmes needed a machine in a box. The next version may only need an app, an algorithm, and a waiting world that wants to believe. There was a time when a black turtleneck and a confident promise were enough to move billions of dollars, bend regulators, and put real patients in harm's way. The lie at the center of Theranos is gone, but the playbook that powered it is very much alive. So how does someone watching this protect their own life, their own money, from the next miracle machine. Start with the red flags that were waving the whole time, even when almost no one wanted to see them. First, secrecy around data. Theranos called its lab methods trade secrets, refused to let outside scientists examine raw results, and locked its devices in a separate room when partners visited. That sounds glamorous, like guarding the crown jewels of a new empire. In medicine, it is the opposite of glamorous. It is a siren. Real breakthroughs publish. They show error rates, false positives, false negatives. When a company says, "Trust us," but never shows the numbers, that is not innovation. That is a blindfold. Second, a refusal to enter the arena of peer-reviewed journals. For years, Theranos claimed to be revolutionizing blood testing, yet never produced robust peer-reviewed studies. No major academic center ran trials and put its name behind the data. Compare that with genuine advances in cancer drugs, vaccines, or gene therapies, which move through university labs, NIH grants, and transparent clinical trials that anyone can scrutinize. If a technology claims to change medicine for millions, but somehow never finds time to be tested in public, the story is already telling you something. Third, over-reliance on celebrity and status. Theranos had generals, former secretaries of state, billionaires, and heirs of great American wealth on its board. They brought money and power, but almost no clinical chemistry expertise. It's an example of what happens when a company collects famous last names instead of qualified skeptics. When the pitch leans on who is in the room rather than what is in the data, respectful distance is healthy. Fourth, the vague technical explanation. Holmes spoke about nanotainers, proprietary chemistry, and a black box that could run hundreds of tests from a finger prick. Yet when pressed, details evaporated into buzzwords. No clear diagrams, no mechanisms, just a promise that the machine in the box would handle it. Real science is often complex, but it can be explained. If the more someone talks, the less you understand, the problem may not be you. Because genuine medical breakthroughs welcome scrutiny, they leave a trail. ClinicalTrials.gov entries, FDA filings, conference talks, independent labs trying to replicate results. Respectful skepticism means checking for that trail. Are there third-party studies? Are regulators involved? Are the loudest cheerleaders financially tied to the company? Or are there experts with nothing to gain who still stand by the claims? His story is one of how power and narrative can seduce even seasoned professionals. Your story does not have to be. The goal is not to become cynical, but to stay open to progress without outsourcing critical thinking to hype and status alone. Let me take you back to the moment when a few people finally said no, and the empire of illusion began to crack. Let me take you back to that moment when the empire of illusion began to crack on the outside, but hardened on the inside. The Wall Street Journal article lands, the myth is challenged in public for the first time, and most executives would pause, reassess, maybe finally tell the truth. Holmes does the opposite. She walks onto TV sets, stands in front of employees, and insists everything is fine, that Theranos technology is not only real, it's revolutionary. To understand why, you have to look at ambition when it fuses with identity. There was a time when Elizabeth Holmes was just a driven Stanford student, the daughter of a government worker family, dreaming of changing medicine. Then the story shifts. She drops out at 19, raises millions, and tells the world that with a single drop of blood, she can run hundreds of tests. Over a few short years, promising founder turns into visionary icon. And her story is one of total identity fusion. She is Theranos, and Theranos is her. When that happens, failure doesn't feel like a setback. It feels like annihilation. If the Edison machine doesn't work, then the genius who left Stanford, who convinced billionaires and generals, who modeled herself on Steve Jobs with the black turtleneck and the deep, deliberate voice, might never have existed. So the lie is not just about money or power. It becomes a shield protecting a fragile self that cannot imagine going back to ordinary life. At the beginning, it is entirely possible she believed the narrative. Early prototypes fail, but that's normal in Silicon Valley. She tells investors they are within months of breakthrough, uses commercial blood analyzers in the back room, and reassures everyone this is temporary. Just a bridge to the future. Just a few more months. It's an example of what happens when temporary exceptions quietly become permanent operating procedures. Then cognitive dissonance takes over. Once someone has told employees, partners, Walgreens, Safeway, and the media that the device works, admitting the truth would mean confessing not only technical failure, but deception. The mind rebels. Because of this pressure, every new contradiction demands a new rationalization. Every bad result invites another excuse. Every whistleblower is recast as a traitor instead of a warning. So when the WSJ investigation exposes that most tests are run on modified commercial machines, Holmes doubles down. Publicly, she calls the reporting false. Internally, lawyers are unleashed, NDAs are tightened, and employees are reminded of their loyalty to the mission. At each fork in the road, she chooses to protect the myth rather than confront reality, and each choice digs the hole deeper, at times inspiring and at times chilling in its determination. Before dismissing this as distant fraud, it's worth asking a smaller question. Where does this live in ordinary careers? The padded resume, the optimistic sales forecast, the startup pitch that quietly upgrades idea to traction. Most people will never run a $9 billion deception, but the same psychological machinery is there, waiting. The real danger comes when the world rewards the illusion, and the applause is loud enough that even the performer starts to believe it. Because once the applause stops, and the tests are wrong, and real patients are harmed, the identity that was built on the lie has only two options: admit everything or fight reality itself. Holmes makes her choice. The world is about to make its own. Holmes is an easy villain. Black turtleneck, fake baritone, a $9 billion empire built on a machine that never worked. It is tempting to freeze her there, like a movie still, and walk away feeling morally superior. But there was a time when she was also a 19-year-old dropout, pacing Stanford's halls, terrified of wasting her life, convinced that if she didn't bet everything on this idea, she would disappear into ordinary. Understanding that tension matters because his story is one of ruthless ambition, hers is one of ruthless certainty. She did not wake up one morning and decide, today, felony fraud. She slid, from exaggeration to omission, from wishful thinking to forged demos, from it will work to it works. That slide does not excuse her. It makes her more dangerous because it shows how a person can lie to the world and to themselves at the same time. And she did not slide alone. Around her sat a board that looked like a geopolitical summit. Henry Kissinger, George Shultz, James Mattis, titans of government, war, diplomacy. Not one of them a practicing scientist. They lent their names, their reputations, their power, but rarely the one thing Theranos needed most: hard questions. They praised her vision, toured the gleaming labs, then went back to their lives while the numbers on the screens never quite matched reality. Investors followed the same script. Venture funds, billionaires, family offices poured in money on the strength of a story and a black box demo. Because of the cultural worship of disruption, secrecy was recast as genius, not a warning sign. Walgreens and Safeway rushed to build blood testing centers, spending hundreds of millions before the technology was proven, treating patients as an acceptable beta test in the race to beat competitors. Then, pattern interrupt. In a world of generals and billionaires, the people who finally cracked the illusion were not the most powerful names in the room. They were 20-somethings in lab coats. Tyler Schultz, the grandson of a board member, watched quality control data being massaged and results quietly discarded. Erica Chung saw machines failing, samples diluted, and results that could send a healthy person to chemotherapy. They were warned, isolated, followed by private investigators, threatened with lawsuits that could erase their careers before they began. Yet they kept talking. To regulators, to lawyers, to a Wall Street Journal reporter named John Carreyrou, who would not let the story go. Their courage was at times inspiring and at times chilling, because it showed how much pressure a system can exert on a single frightened person who simply refuses to lie. It is an example of what happens when an entire environment rewards the illusion. Weak oversight, dazzled media profiles, a valley culture that treats doubt as disloyalty, and fake it till you make it as a business model. Holmes bears primary responsibility. Those choices were hers. But preventing the next Theranos means changing the world that cheered those choices, paid for them, and only asked real questions once real patients were already bleeding. And the moment those questions finally arrive, the empire has to answer. And the moment those questions finally arrive, the empire has to answer. But here is the uncomfortable part. That empire only existed because so many powerful people desperately wanted the answer to be yes. Yes, a single drop of blood could replace vials. Yes, one teenage prodigy could fix a broken healthcare system. Yes, there was a shortcut. Theranos thrived not only because Elizabeth Holmes lied, but because her lie wrapped itself around something painfully real: fear of illness, hatred of needles, frustration with slow, expensive medicine. It offered a clean, glamorous solution to problems that, in real life, are anything but clean. There was a time when that story felt almost inevitable. Silicon Valley had already given the world pocket supercomputers, overnight billionaires, and apps that made taxis appear like magic. So when a 19-year-old Stanford dropout promised to revolutionize blood testing, it fit perfectly into a narrative everyone already loved: the lone genius, changing life for millions, while investors cashed in on the next empire of health. Because of that narrative, red flags looked less like danger and more like evidence of brilliance. Secrecy? That meant trade secrets, unreliable lab results, growing pains, a board packed with generals and former secretaries of state, but almost no scientists? To believers, that was proof of power and inevitability, not imbalance. Every tiny success was treated as destiny fulfilled. Every warning was dismissed as noise from people who didn't get it. This is confirmation bias at work, not in a psychology textbook, but in boardrooms and pharmacies. Once the story was set, Holmes as the visionary savior, Theranos as the future of medicine, information stopped being neutral. Supporters searched for anything that confirmed what they already hoped was true, and quietly pushed away anything that suggested a slower, messier reality, where reform means regulation, training, infrastructure, and years of unglamorous work. Because that is the real trade-off here. Believe in a miracle box, or accept that fixing healthcare means changing how hospitals bill, how labs are regulated, how care is delivered to people in poverty who cannot pay. One path promised wealth, prestige, and magazine covers. The other promised committees, spreadsheets, and angry lobbyists. One was a story about a savior. The other was a story about shared responsibility. So his story is one of a single founder, yes, but at times inspiring and at times chilling. It is also an example of what happens when a culture prefers myth to maintenance. The lesson is less about one woman's fall from grace and more about how easily money, power, and hope can be steered toward anyone who promises everything with no cost, no delay, no sacrifice. Before this story closes, there is one more question. In your own life, where are you most tempted to believe in a Theranos because the alternative, slow change, hard conversations, honest limits, feels too uncomfortable to face? There was a time when a 19-year-old dropout walked out of Stanford with a sketch of an idea and walked into Silicon Valley with a promise. One tiny drop of blood, hundreds of tests, instant answers. From that promise came Theranos, a $9 billion empire built on secrecy, status, and a machine that never truly worked. Not only did it seduce billionaires and former generals, it slipped into real clinics, into pharmacies, into the quiet routines of patients who trusted the white lab coat. Let me take you back to the arc in one sweep. A teenager haunted by the fear of disease in her family turns that fear into a mission. She drops out, raises seed money, and wraps herself in the costume of a visionary founder. Black turtleneck, deep voice, relentless talk about changing the world. Investors line up. Walgreens and Safeway write checks. The board fills with former cabinet secretaries and military brass. Behind the curtain, engineers fight machines that give wildly different results from the same sample. Lab workers rerun tests on conventional analyzers, and critical reports are buried or rewritten. The valuation climbs anyway. This story is one of momentum without brakes. Because ambition was unchecked and oversight was weak. A failed prototype did not die in a lab. It metastasized into a nationwide rollout. In software, that might mean angry users and lost money. In medicine, it means misdiagnosed cancers, false HIV positives, people changing medications based on numbers that were fiction. It is an example of what happens when a life and death domain is treated like a demo day pitch, when the performance on stage matters more than the blood in the vial. So what does this mean for anyone watching, far away from Silicon Valley? First, demand evidence. Not vibes, not branding, not a TED-style story about childhood trauma and destiny. Ask, what independent tests back this up? Who has seen the data? Who would lose their license if this is wrong? If the only proof lives in a glossy deck and a founder's charisma, the risk is not abstract. Second, question narratives that feel too perfect. The dropout genius, the miracle device, the overnight revolution that somehow avoids all the boring regulations everyone else has to follow. When a story has no trade-offs, no delays, no ugly phase where things break and people admit it, that is not a sign of brilliance. That is a warning label. Third, pay attention to how people respond when confronted with inconvenient facts. At Theranos, critics were threatened. Whistleblowers were hunted by lawyers and private investigators, and internal dissent was framed as betrayal rather than caution. In any workplace, when honest questions are met with character attacks, sudden secrecy, or pressure to get on the bus, the problem is rarely the question. These lessons do not stop at startups. Apply them to politicians promising effortless prosperity, influencers selling financial freedom with no risk, managers in your own life rolling out a grand strategy but refusing to share numbers. Wherever big promises meet little transparency, the Theranos pattern can appear. So as this story closes, one last decision belongs to you. When you look at Elizabeth Holmes, Do you see a visionary who lost control of the story she created? Or a con artist who always knew the machine did not work? And more importantly, how will that answer shape the next big promise you choose to believe or walk away from? So now the verdict doesn't belong to a jury or a judge. It belongs to you. After everything in this story, after the black turtlenecks, the billion-dollar promises, the lab reports, and the ruined lives, where do you land on Elizabeth Holmes? Tragic overreacher who flew too close to the sun, calculated fraudster who built an empire on a lie, or something messier, somewhere in between those two clean labels? There was a time when she was a 19-year-old Stanford dropout, sketching a painless blood test on a dorm room whiteboard, talking about saving her family from cancer and bringing cheap diagnostics to people living in poverty. Investors heard a story of life and death, of technology and mercy, and they poured in money. Walgreens and Safeway spent hundreds of millions. Generals, former secretaries of state, a media-anointed, youngest self-made female billionaire, all lined up behind one charismatic founder. At times inspiring and at times chilling, that rise asks a simple question: what did she actually believe? So that's where the audience comes in. In the comments, lay out the moment where optimism, in your view, snapped into knowing deception. Was it the day Theranos began running real patient samples on hacked commercial machines while still claiming the Edison could do 200 tests from a single drop of blood? Was it when internal lab failures were buried and reports allegedly altered to look validated by pharmaceutical giants? Or did the line appear even earlier, the second secrecy, NDAs, and legal threats became more important than scientific truth? If this story feels uncomfortably familiar, say so. Maybe there was a manager who sold a fantasy roadmap the team knew could never ship, a startup that raised on a demo that only worked once, or a leader who punished anyone asking basic questions. Maybe speaking up meant risking a job, a career, even a family's stability, and silence felt safer. Those quiet rooms, those hallway conversations, are where empires of illusion either die early or keep growing until the crash finally reaches the public. Let me take you back to the core danger here. Health tech is not a photo app. When numbers on a screen control diagnoses, pregnancies, chemotherapy, the cost of one exaggeration multiplies fast. So what safeguards would you demand next time? More aggressive regulation before devices touch patients, media that treats every revolutionary claim as guilty until proven innocent, or stronger whistleblower protections so a 22-year-old lab worker doesn't have to choose between conscience and rent. This channel exists for that kind of analysis. Power, ambition, money, the way one person's dream can become everyone else's risk. His story is one of business legends, but these stories are warnings too. It's an example of what happens when charisma outruns accountability, when wealth and reputation insulate a founder from basic questions. So leave your verdict, your experiences, your safeguards below, because the next world-changing pitch is already being written. And in the next part, the pattern behind those pitches is about to come into focus. And in the next part, the pattern behind those pitches is about to come into focus. Because behind every glossy keynote, every breathless profile, every billion-dollar valuation, there was a time when the story looked clean. Polished decks, standing ovations, magazine covers. What never makes it on stage is the pressure, the compromises, the quiet moment when someone decides to bend reality instead of disappoint the room. Elizabeth Holmes is not an isolated glitch. Her story is one of scale. The $9 billion number is loud, but the mechanism is familiar. A miracle claim, a closed-door lab, a board packed with power and almost no scientists, contracts with Walgreens and Safeway built on trust rather than verified data. It's an example of what happens when charisma outruns accountability, when the costume and the voice and the myth feel safer than the truth. That is why this channel exists. To take the glossy myth and turn it back into what it really is. A long, messy life. A family history. A trail of emails, contracts, and late-night decisions. To walk through the rise, the rot, and finally the reckoning, so patterns stop feeling like coincidences and start looking like warnings. Let me take you back to the boardrooms, the labs, the investor calls, and show how the empire is built, defended, and then, under the right pressure, cracks. If this kind of deep dive into business legends, scandals, and the psychology behind them is valuable, don't just click away to the next shiny pitch. Subscribe and turn on notifications so the next time a world-changing founder appears on your feed, there is already a map in your head of how these stories can go right and how they can go very, very wrong. Pattern interrupt for a second. The next episode does not have to be about Holmes at all. Who should be next? Another fallen unicorn that went from hypergrowth to courtroom? A still-worshipped founder whose fans defend every move? An entire industry where the incentives look dangerously familiar, where the money is huge, the oversight is weak, and the promises are getting bigger every quarter. Leave it in the comments. Names, companies, sectors. The more specific, the better. Because the more these stories are unpacked in public, the harder it is for the next $9 billion lie to grow in the dark. The more people understand how fake lab reports, weaponized NDAs, and a carefully engineered image can sway generals, billionaires, and even doctors, the less likely they are to be hypnotized by a black turtleneck and a catchphrase. At times inspiring and at times chilling, these stories are not just entertainment, they are a form of armor. So if you want more stories they don't tell on stage, subscribe, hit the bell, and leave your target in the comments. The next empire is already being pitched. Let's learn how to see it clearly before the lights go out.